Taylor was enjoying a quiet morning at the newly opened cafe, visiting her best friend and savoring the warmth of freshly brewed coffee. She was 5.5 months pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she laughed at small stories and shared in the excitement of the shop's first weeks. The calm atmosphere shattered the moment David stormed in, ordering a coffee. When it arrived wrong, a simple mistake in a new cafe, he erupted in anger, shouting at Taylor's friend with venom that made the small shop fall silent. Without hesitation, Taylor stepped forward to defend her friend, only for David to shove her hard. "Get out of my way," he spat, and Taylor crashed to the floor, her hands clutching her belly, panic washing over her as fear and pain mixed in every heartbeat. What David didn't see was the silver-haired figure observing from the back, calm but with eyes that could pierce through steel. Admiral Brenner, his superior, watching every cruel gesture and reckless shove. 2 minutes later, the Admiral moved with decisive precision, taking David down to the floor before he could react. David's towering bravado crumbled instantly, his face pressed against the polished hardwood, tears streaming as the weight of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. His cries of regret filled the cafe, leaving everyone stunned in silence. But what led to this explosive confrontation? Who is Admiral Brenner, and why does he carry such authority over David? The answers will unravel a story of courage, justice, and unexpected redemption. But before we proceed, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now let's understand how this story really began. The scent of fresh espresso mingled with the sharp tang of drying paint, an almost antiseptic sweetness that clung to the air of the Anchor, a newly minted coffee shop perched 2 blocks from the gates of Coronado. Sunlight sliced through the wide windows, cutting across the polished hardwood floors and reflecting off stainless steel counters. Taylor Vance leaned against the edge of the service counter, her right hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her abdomen, tracing the outline of life within. At 5.5 months, her pregnancy was no secret. The curve of her belly caught the light with the quiet assertion of inevitability. Her eyes, brown and deep, moved constantly, observing the tiny cafe with an almost surgical precision, cataloging the placement of tables, the angle of chairs, the workflow of the single barista, Sarah, who stood across from her, hands trembling as she navigated her first day. The small bell above the door jingled, sharp and insistent, drawing both Taylor's and Sarah's attention. The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly, the microcosm of calm was breached. David Thorne entered with the kinetic confidence of someone accustomed to authority, though unearned. His high and tight haircut glinted under the overhead lighting, every line of his jaw set like steel. A tight black t-shirt clung to his chest and biceps, the bold slogan "Pain is weakness" leaving the body etched across it, a badge of self-perception. His eyes flicked over the cafe with the measured assessment of a predator, foot tapping against the floor as if counting the seconds until his impatience demanded satisfaction. "Black coffee, no sugar, make it fast," he barked, each word clipped, devoid of nuance, carrying the subtle intimidation of a man who demanded compliance rather than requested it. Sarah's hand shook as she lifted the cup from the machine, her fingers brushing against the hot ceramic. Taylor's gaze remained fixed on the scene, her body language measured, controlled, a living barrier of calm in the face of incipient chaos. David took the cup, lifted it to his lips, and after a deliberate sip, his face twisted into a grimace. He spat it back into the cup. "I said black, this has cream. Are you deaf or just stupid?" His voice sliced through the shop like a scalpel. The cafe fell into a suspended silence. Every patron, every staff member, froze mid-breath, mid-movement, caught in the gravity of the moment. Taylor stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Her voice was calm, precise, almost disarmingly even. "It's her first day, just ask for another one." David's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowed, sweeping over her belly with contempt, the ghost of disdain flickering across his features. "Mind your business, breeding cow," he spat, the words laced with venom. The syllables hit Taylor like the blunt edge of a tactical strike. Her breath caught, shallow and fast, hand tightening on the edge of the counter. "You need to leave," Taylor said, her tone devoid of hesitation, crisp with the authority of someone who had made impossible decisions under fire. David's jaw flexed, each muscle pronounced, a physical manifestation of suppressed rage. "I don't take orders from civilians." Then he shoved her, hard, the movement was mechanical, but loaded with malice. Taylor stumbled backward, hips landing against the edge of the counter. Tane flared sharply, a white-hot spike radiating up her side. She cried out, one hand flying instinctively to her stomach as she slid to the floor in agonizing slow motion, her back scraping the polished hardwood. David wiped his hands, expression a mask of satisfaction. "Stay out of my way," he growled, turning toward the exit with the presumption of impunity. A sudden, uncompromising grip seized his shoulder. Steel. Unyielding. David reacted instantly, swinging, voice rising in instinctive threat. "Get off me, old." The strike came with surgical precision. A fluid sweep of the leg, a twisting of the wrist, and David's face met the hardwood with a sickening thud. The air was expelled from his lungs in a controlled, violent expulsion. A polished dress shoe pressed the pressure point behind his ear, immobilizing him. Rear Admiral Thomas Brenner, the silver-haired man stated, voice low, controlled, each syllable carrying the weight of decades of command. "And you, candidate, just put hands on the widow of the man who dragged me out of a burning hell in Kandahar." David's eyes widened, pupils dilating as comprehension of his miscalculation struck. Tane, fear, and the raw imprint of guilt washed across his features. A broken whimper escaped him, involuntary and pitiful. Taylor, seated on the floor, breath ragged, hand still cupping her belly, watched the man who had threatened her with a mixture of detached calculation and quiet gratitude. Each small twitch of her lips, each blink, each subtle shift of weight spoke of resilience and the instinctive assessment of a situation that had already spun into controlled chaos. The cafe remained still. The only sound was the shallow, uneven respiration of a man finally confronted with consequences he could not maneuver around. The cafe remained suspended in a fragile tableau, the only movement the shallow, ragged inhalations of David Thorne as he struggled against the pressure of Brenner's hold. His chest heaved, nostrils flaring, eyes flicking erratically between the polished wood beneath him and the steel-cold gaze of the man kneeling beside Taylor Vance. Sweat glistened along his temple, a fine bead tracing the sharp line of his jaw as his fingers flexed, unconsciously testing the boundaries of the restraining grip. The air was thick, carrying the residual scent of coffee, paint, and blood, sharp, metallic, undeniable. Brenner's hand relaxed slightly, releasing the mechanical lock on David's wrist, yet his stance, his body language, communicated containment far beyond physicality. The weight of decades spent in combat, in command, in high-stakes operations, radiated from him, a kinetic authority that required no volume. Taylor, still seated on the hardwood, rocked slightly on her heels, one hand still pressed to her abdomen, tracing the subtle, rapid movements beneath the fabric as her baby responded to the shock. Her eyes, wide but focused, held a flicker of calculation behind the initial fear. "Talk to me, Taylor, the baby." Brenner's voice was calm, surgical, each syllable measured. There was no rush, only the controlled cadence of someone who understood the fragility of life and the precise thresholds of risk. Taylor's lips parted, a wince escaping before the words, a micro-expression betraying the spike of pain along her hip from the counter edge. "He's kicking, just scared me," she said, tone low but deliberate, a whisper carrying authority born of instinctual protective reflex. Her hand tightened slightly around the fabric of her dress, thumb tracing the silver seal trident locket at her throat, a talisman of past sacrifice, of survival, of unresolved grief. Brenner's eyes followed the movement, noting the precise angle of the chain, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the micro-flares of her pupils reflecting a controlled calculation of safety and environment. David forced himself upright, shaking, the blood from his nose streaking across his upper lip, drying in thin, angry lines. He blinked repeatedly, as if recalibrating his perception of reality, his gaze darting to Brenner's shoes, then Taylor, then back up to the Admiral's face. "Admiral, I didn't know who she was, I swear." His voice cracked on the last syllable, a tremor revealing the collapse of constructed bravado. Brenner's head tilted fractionally, the corners of his mouth taut, but unreadable. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. Every syllable he spoke carried the weight of operational certainty. "Your bud, S-Class 342, Hell Week is 6 weeks out. I know every face in that class. I know your instructors, and now I know your soul." The words landed like kinetic impact, David's knees trembling beneath him. A bead of sweat slipped from his temple, tracing the rigid plane of his cheekbone. His fists clench and unclench, knuckles whitening, the minute tick of a shaking jaw betraying the cognitive dissonance between self-perception and reality. "Please, sir." "It was a mistake," he stammered, the syllables brittle, hollow. Brenner leaned forward just slightly, a subtle yet undeniable assertion of proximity, until David could detect the faint aroma of coffee on his breath, the quiet hum of authority. "A mistake is a typo, assaulting a pregnant Gold Star widow is a chose." The cadence was precise, surgical. There was no room for negotiation. The words were a verdict delivered with the inevitability of gravity. Outside, sirens approach, faint at first, then growing, a mechanical acknowledgement that the civilian world would soon intervene. Brenner did not flinch. He shifted his weight slightly, releasing enough to allow David to remain upright but no more. "You're not going to the brig today." "That would be too easy," he said, eyes boring into the younger man's, stripping away layers of pretense and exposing the raw, unvarnished consequences of choice, action, and moral failure. David's chest rose and fell rapidly, nostrils flaring, lips parting in silent intake, as the first real comprehension of accountability sank in. Every fiber of his body, from tensed calves to flexed shoulders, betrayed the collapse of certainty. He was physically intact, but the unspoken mental and moral audit, conducted with the precision of a Tier 1 operator, had already begun. Taylor exhaled slowly, hands still pressed against the curve of her belly, eyes meeting Brenner's for a fleeting second, gratitude mingling with lingering adrenaline. Her body remained a measured counterpoint to the chaos surrounding her, each micro-movement calibrated for protection, for stability, for survival. The cafe, once a space of casual normalcy, had been transformed into a crucible, every surface a witness, every sound a vector of consequence. The metallic tang of antiseptic clung to the air, mingling with the faint warmth of recycled hospital ventilation. The rhythmic whoosh of the ultrasound machine filled the small, sterile room, a mechanical heartbeat overlaid with the occasional soft click of buttons and the muted shuffle of feet. Taylor Vance lay reclined on the exam table, the curve of her belly fully pronounced beneath the thin hospital gown. Her right hand rested lightly on the swell of life beneath her, fingers tracing the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of the baby, each flicker against her palm an assertion of resilience. Her eyes, glossy with tears, tracked the screen with surgical focus, capturing every contraction, every heartbeat, every visible limb. "He's a fighter, Thomas." "Just like Mike," she said, voice low, controlled, the words carrying a measured pride that masked the vulnerability underneath. Her lips quivered faintly, betraying the surge of emotion that her eyes sought to conceal. Brenner stood a step back, hands folded behind him, posture rigid but non-intrusive. The lines along his face were carved with the faint fatigue of years in command, each micro-expression calibrated, each flicker of his eyes communicating more than words could convey. He did not look directly at the screen. His gaze lingered on a point beyond it, a practiced method to distance his mind from the ghost of operational memory. "Mike should be here," he said quietly, almost to himself, voice even, measured, weighted by history. Taylor's eyes lifted, meeting his briefly. "If you were, that boy wouldn't be breathing," she replied, tone sharp with quiet authority, each word a pinpoint of emotional precision. Her lips pressed into a thin line, exhaling slowly as if to regulate both the room's and her own rhythm. A faint micro-tick, a slight narrowing of her left eye betrayed her suppressed tension, her professional instinct to maintain composure even under emotional strain. Brenner exhaled, shoulders shifting imperceptibly, and closed a thick, manila file with a crisp snap. The sound punctuated the sterile room, almost reverberating against the tile and steel. His eyes, sharp and assessing, followed the edge of the folder's cover before settling into a focused scrutiny. "David Thorne, top 1% physically," he stated. Tone precise, the cadence deliberate. "Tier evaluations, absolute 0, he's a bully in a candidate uniform." Taylor's hand flexed slightly over her belly, fingernails pressing lightly into the skin, a silent channeling of both emotion and instinctive protective energy. "He can't earn the trident," she said, voice steady, measured, yet carrying the subtle undercurrent of moral certainty. Her shoulders shifted back imperceptibly, each micro-adjustment a subconscious alignment with her own inner code, the same code that had guided her through operations and trauma alike. Brenner's eyes darkened, a shadow passing across the iris, just enough to signal the internal computation of consequence and strategy. "He won't," he replied, tone low, but firm enough to carry the finality of command. "But expulsion is paperwork. Paperwork doesn't teach lessons." His gaze tracked Taylor's hand over the trident locket, a reflexive acknowledgement of her connection to both legacy and personal history. "I'm keeping him in the pipeline, because the higher he climbs, the harder he falls." The words were deliberate, a professional calculus of cause, effect, and controlled consequence. Taylor exhaled softly, a micro-movement of her jaw releasing the tension she had carried since the cafe. Her thumb traced the locket chain, a minute gesture of reassurance, of remembrance, of silent dialogue with the past. The ultrasound monitor continued its mechanical rhythm, each pulse a reminder of life, survival, and the silent reckoning unfolding in real time. Brenner's stance remained as it had throughout her pregnancy and every mission that demanded unwavering precision, a blend of vigilance, calculated restraint, and authority that brooked no error. Outside the room, the hum of the hospital continued, distant voices filtered through closed doors, a muted world continuing unaware of the moral and operational calculus at work in this sterile enclave. Taylor's eyes lingered on the flicker of movement on the screen, each tiny kick, each heartbeat, a declaration of resilience and inherited strength. Brenner's hands remained clasped behind him, posture rigid, eyes unwavering, silently cataloging every detail, every micro-expression, every flicker of emotional truth. The room existed in its own suspended continuum, a precise intersection of human vulnerability, operational ethics, and the quiet professionalism of those who had seen the cost of Chosun action firsthand. The morning sun pounded down on Coronado, an unrelenting blaze that reflected off the wet sand and the dark, damp neoprene of the candidates' wetsuits. Sweat pooled beneath the straps of their gear, stinging the eyes, sliding down the spine in a slick river of salt and effort. The air was heavy, almost viscous, carrying the scent of brine, diesel, and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. Class 340 to form, in precise, rigid lines, each candidate's body a study in controlled exhaustion and muscle memory owned under months of progressive stress. David Thorne's eyes darted compulsively, tracking the shifting shadows across the beach, every motion amplified in his perception. His jaw flexed continuously, a microtick that betrayed the adrenalized anticipation thrumming through his system. Nostrils flared as he drew ragged breaths, the salt-laden air burning his lungs. He hadn't slept in days. The cumulative fatigue weighed heavily on his ocular muscles, the faint tremor in his eyelids a sign of both physical and psychological strain. His hands, calloused from pull-ups and tattles, flexed into fists, knuckles whitening intermittently, a subconscious calibration of readiness against anticipated corrections from instructors or MPS. Instructor Miller approached, the very embodiment of kinetic authority. Standing like a human monolith, broad-shouldered and immovable, his presence alone commanded micro-adjustments in posture from every candidate within line of sight. The ground seemed to respond to his steps with subtle vibrations, each heel strike punctuating his words. "Thorne, Admiral Brenner has taken a personal interest in your development. You are class leader for Hell Week. Do not disappoint him." His voice was low, cutting through the heat and fatigue with surgical precision. David blinked, the faint tremor in his eyelids betraying a mixture of disbelief and simmering calculation. A twisted smirk crossed his face, tight-lipped but full of distorted pride. The micro-expression was fleeting, yet deliberate. He believed it reflected the Admiral's respect for raw strength. His shoulders squared, chest rising slightly as if to physically embody the acknowledgement of this perceived honor, his muscles flexing under sunburned skin. 200 yards away, Brenner's figure was a still silhouette against the horizon, binoculars raised, scanning, observing, calculating. Every minor adjustment of his hands, every flick of the wrist, communicated strategic intent. His eyes followed the subtle shifts in David's posture, reading intent, arrogance, and latent weakness in the candidate's micro-movements. He took the bait. "Commence Phase 1, Brenner murmured under his breath, the cadence precise, measured, carrying the inevitability of operational execution. From that moment, Hell Week transformed from a physical crucible into David's personal inferno. Waterlogged boats became cumbersome instruments of relentless punishment. Each candidate's body, already fatigued, responded with micro-contractions of effort as they lifted, pushed, and carried with mechanical precision. David's boat crew, a rotating cadre of equally exhausted peers, grunted in sync, sweat blurring into the brine-soaked sand beneath their boots. Breaks were truncated, each interruption a controlled insertion of special evolutions, deliberate deviations designed to strip rhythm, morale, and self-perception. David's jaw clenched over and over, each contraction a silent reinforcement of willpower, masking creeping doubt behind the taut veneer of resolve. His eyes, scanning continuously, tracked every shadow, every subtle shift in instructor positioning, the micro-adjustments of fellow candidates' bodies. Each flicker of sand, each reflection off wet neoprene, registered as a potential threat or opportunity, amplifying his hypervigilance to almost pathological levels. Despite exhaustion, each breath, drawn shallow and rapid, was a disciplined exercise in physiological control, regulating oxygen flow to maintain output despite cumulative fatigue. Sweat stunned the salt-cracked skin of his forehead, slid into eyes that blinked rapidly to clear irritation. His fingers flexed, tracing the lines of rope, wet straps, and canvas with the practiced instinct of someone who had internalized the operational rhythm of maritime and amphibious exertion. He believed, with a rigid, unyielding certainty, that survival here equated to dominance, that only the strongest, the most calculated, the most relentless, would emerge intact. Yet the reality was a crucible, testing moral calculus, resilience, and humility in tandem with physicality. Every evolution, every shift, every gritted teeth contraction was a lesson, calibrated by Brenner's unseen hand, executed through the unrelenting choreography of pain, effort, and the unforgiving heat of Coronado under the midday sun. Thursday night had a metallic bite, the salt of Coronado still clinging to David Thorne's skin, soaked through the neoprene of his wetsuit, his muscles screaming from the relentless tempo of Hell Week. The hallucination phase had begun in earnest, sleep-deprived visions bleeding into reality, each shadow, potential threat, every sound amplified to a sharp edge against his nerves. He moved mechanically, guided by ingrained muscle memory, when a summons from the medical bay arrived, a soft command in the low hum of fluorescent lights. Expecting warmth, a temporary reprieve, he walked the sterile corridors, boots clicking against tile, eyes darting over the environment, scanning for cues, exits, and threats. Instead of comfort, a laptop awaited him. Its screen glowed, casting the cold light of operational reality onto his drained face. The sterile hum of machines was replaced by the crisp, authoritative voice of Rear Admiral Brenner over the speaker system. Security threat at tomorrow's Gold Star Widows Gala. You're being pulled from the SURF for VIP protective detail. Guest of honor satisfaction is mandatory. Fail, and you ring the bell. David froze for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of disbelief crossing his face. Eyebrows rose, nostrils flaring slightly, lips pressed together in a thin, controlled line. The corners of his mouth twitched, an involuntary tick as his mind parsed the situation with the precision of a trained operator. The cold, delirious delirium of sleep deprivation mingled with relief, a change in role, a temporary assignment, and, crucially, an escape from hypothermia. His lips curved into a brief, tight grin. A waiter job, mundane, civilian, almost trivial, was preferable to the frozen chaos of the SURF. Within the hour, he had been scrubbed and shaved, the rough stubble gone from his jaw, and stuffed into dress blues to sizes too small. The uniform pressed against muscle and sinew like a second skin forced into confinement, every seam a tactile reminder of discipline, hierarchy, and appearance. Every adjustment of cuffs, collar, and trousers carried the weight of precision. Buttons were checked twice, creases pressed sharp and unyielding. He moved with mechanical grace, muscles still singing from exertion, eyes scanning for tactical advantage even in ceremonial form. At the officers' club, he was delivered into the fluorescent glare of the banquet hall. The polished floors reflected the soft lighting overhead, a field of mirrored surfaces amplifying every small movement. David's hand wrapped around the handle of a water pitcher, the metal cool against the dampness of his palm. He advanced toward the table, eyes tracking the rhythm of the guests, calculating angles, anticipating micro-movements, noting distances and possible breaches. Refill my water. Cold, came a crisp, authoritative command from a chair at the far side of the table. The words were casual, yet delivered with an economy of motion and expectation that signaled command. David's lips pressed into a tight line, eyes narrowing slightly, a micro-tick of his left eyelid betraying the instant recognition of the order's origin. He stepped carefully around the chair, boots clicking lightly against the polished floor. As he approached, the woman turned, time seemed to contract. Taylor Vance, radiant in an evening gown that hugged the swell of her belly, rotated into view. The curvature of her abdomen was impossible to miss. Her posture carried elegance, control, and an understated command of presence that drew the eye without effort. Her hand lightly rested on the table's edge, fingers flexing subtly, a micro-adjustment that communicated both readiness and grace. The pitcher rattled in David's hand, ice clinking sharply, each strike resonating like gunshots in the focused silence of his perception. His chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths, nostrils flaring as he calibrated grip, trajectory, and alignment. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, mingling with the residual salt from days of exertion, his jaw flexing in a controlled, repetitive micro-movement. To see an ostensibly benign act of service had become a crucible of precision, perception, and silent acknowledgement of past transgressions. His fingers tightened reflexively around the pitcher handle, knuckles whitening as his peripheral vision tracked every subtle shift in the room, every micro-expression, every flicker of movement that could be relevant to the protection of the guest of honor. David's eyes met Taylor's briefly, a fraction of recognition passing, unspoken, filtered through the weight of prior actions, of moral calculus, and the invisible hierarchy that Brenner had engineered with surgical precision. The grand ballroom of the O Club was a sea of polished uniforms, glinting metals, and muted chandeliers. Air conditioning struggled against the collected body heat and the residual scent of fried hors d'oeuvres. David Thorne moved like a shadow along the perimeter of the room, each step measured, precise, a mechanical extension of discipline rather than chose. His eyes tracked Taylor Vance with obsessive focus, scanning for any imperfection, any lapse that could be exploited. His jaw flexed with a subtle, repeated tick, nostrils flaring with each shallow breath. Every muscle in his body screamed fatigue, but his control remained absolute, every movement governed by relentless, silent calculus. Taylor moved with quiet authority, her posture impeccable even under the weight of her pregnancy. Her hand lightly rested on her purse, adjusting the strap, flexing her fingers with imperceptible micro-movements that telegraphed readiness. She greeted admirals with a nod, exchanged pleasantries with precision, each smile contained, exact, a reflection of both training and grief harnessed into professionalism. David's hand hovered near her purse, a subconscious effort to anticipate any potential hazard, the tips of his fingers twitching ever so slightly, a micro-expression of tension disguised as control. Across the room, Brenner's eyes were a steady presence, unblinking, assessing, dissecting. Every time David faltered, whether a micro-step too slow or a glance that lingered to lawn on a bystander, Brenner's gaze locked on him like a laser, forcing recalibration of posture, micro-adjustments in gait, the tightening of fists, the subtle set of shoulders. The room became a theater of constant micro-corrections, every moment a measure exercise in obedience and humiliation. A drunk civilian donor collided with David, sending a tray of hors d'oeuvres crashing to the floor. The metallic clang of fallen utensils reverberated sharply through the room, a stark punctuation against polite chatter. David's fingers curled into a tight fist, the knuckles whitening, his jaw flexing. A micro-tick flickered at the corner of his eye, the barest quiver of awareness, as he muttered under his breath, "Watch it, fat." The words were clipped, sharp, an instinctive projection of dominance, yet a breathless glance toward Brenner immediately corrected the trajectory of aggression. Taylor's voice cut through the air, surgical and precise, a scalpel against the hum of background noise. "Candidate Thorne, apologize." The syllables were economical, delivered with crystalline authority. His lips tightened further, jaw muscles contracting in a silent struggle between ego and protocol. He stared at her, eyes narrowed, pure hate burning just beneath the surface, yet every micro-expression tempered by the knowledge of surveillance and consequence. Taylor's gaze flicked toward the podium, her hand gesturing toward the brass bell with subtle authority. "Or ring the bell," she said, each word an exercise in controlled menace. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, yet carried the weight of both literal and symbolic consequences. David exhaled sharply, forced the words through clenched teeth, voice raw. "My fault, sir." The syllables were mechanically precise, stripped of genuine contrition, yet the act itself an immediate containment of escalation. Hours passed, the ballroom a relentless sequence of ceremonial motion and muted social strategy. Eventually, the room emptied, leaving only the scent of food, faint perfume, and the echo of polished shoes against tile. In the empty kitchen, shadows pooled in corners, and David, unguarded by observation, approached Taylor. His chest rose in rapid, shallow breaths, nostrils flaring, fists flexing and unclenching in subtle, unconscious repetition. "You think this is funny? When I get my trident, you're nothing. Just a lonely widow milking a dead man's ghost." The words carried the heat of ego, but calculated intimidation filtered through the fog of prior humiliation. Taylor did not flinch. Her stance remained composed, subtle shifts of weight grounding her. Lips pressed into a thin line, eyes unyielding. "You still don't understand, David. The trident doesn't make the man makes the trident." Her words were precise, rhythmically controlled, each syllable weighted with the authority of experience and moral certainty. She turned away, steps measured and even, leaving the empty room to hum with the residual tension. David's gaze followed, micro-expressions of disbelief, frustration, and restrained rage flickering across his face. Yet he remained oblivious to the red blinking light in the smoke detector overhead, a silent witness to the orchestration of consequences beyond his comprehension. 2 months had passed since the Gold Star Widows Gala, and Coronado's coastline had become both crucible and proving ground for Class 342. The final week abode, as third phase unfolded under the merciless sun, each hour a relentless test of endurance, mental acuity, and tactical execution. The air was thick with salt spray and sweat, a constant reminder of the ocean's omnipresent claim on the candidates' bodies. Every breath was drawn through lungs conditioned by weeks of hypothermic immersion and sleep deprivation, shallow yet precise, the rhythm a conscious counter to the creeping fatigue. David Thorne moved among his peers with the measured, almost predatory grace of one accustomed to the fine line between dominance and survival. His body was taut, muscles rippling beneath skin bronzed by sun and salt, veins prominent along forearms flexed with subtle, controlled contractions. Micro-tics betrayed nothing. His eyelids flickered minimally, a brief twitch during calculated assessments of his surroundings, yet each movement was calibrated to suggest ease, superiority, and confidence. The arrogance he projected was seamless, internalized as a shield against scrutiny and a weapon against perceived weakness in others. He believed, with absolute certainty, that the Admiral's interventions were nothing more than carefully orchestrated hazing, a test of psychological resilience and technical skill masquerading as punitive measures. Each micro-adjustment in posture, shoulders squared, spine rigid, hands lightly flexed at his sides, was an unconscious reinforcement of that belief. Every interaction with instructors and fellow candidates was filtered through a lens of superiority, his gaze sharp and evaluative, scanning for hesitation, flaw, or lapse, a predator measuring prey and peer alike. The beach operations were a choreography of exhaustion and precision. Inflatable boats dragged through surf-fan sand, each oar stroke, each coordinated lift, a testament to synchronized muscle memory developed under the duress of prior weeks. David's hands, calloused and chalk-streaked, gripped rope and aluminum with precise, almost obsessive control. Every tendon flexed, every wrist adjusted for optimal leverage, a subtle dance of biomechanics honed through repetition and pain. Micro-expressions flickered across his face, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the corner of the eye, a shallow inhale through the nose, small betrayals of both fatigue and satisfaction, hidden beneath the veneer of unshakable confidence. During brief periods of enforced rest, candidates collapsed in sand-etched shadows, gasping through lips cracked from salt and sun. David, however, remained physically untouchable, his frame a study in kinetic efficiency. The chest rose and fell in controlled rhythm, shoulders adjusting imperceptibly, a subtle flex of the biceps as he repositioned, each movement reflecting not only survival, but mastery over the imposed environment. He scanned the horizon for pattern recognition, anticipating instructor maneuvers, timing every motion to maximize endurance and minimize exposure to corrective feedback. He had reconstructed his internal narrative. The Admiral was not executing a personal vendetta, not enforcing moral accountability, but rather engineering a crucible for greatness. His mind catalogued every correction, every micro-failure, as data points feeding the illusion of voluntary growth. Instructors' calls, whistle blasts, and measured physical corrections were filtered through the lens of strategy and projected respect. David's lips curved in the briefest, controlled smirk at each minor triumph, muscle memory, tactical execution, and psychological manipulation converging into the illusion of superiority. Even as he dominated physically, David's micro-expressions revealed the unconscious awareness of scrutiny, a flicker of awareness at Brenner's distant silhouette along the beach, the twitch of a fist momentarily flexing, a shallow intake of breath at the echo of whistle commands. Every subtle movement was a reflection of training and ego, ambition and carefully curated perception. He was untouchable, he told himself, yet the environment, the observers, the history of his prior transgressions all lingered invisibly, shaping micro-decisions in ways imperceptible even to him. By the close of the day, as shadows lengthened over the surf and sand, David Thorne strode along the beach with the arrogance of invincibility fully restored. The tide lapped against neoprene boots, carrying the faint salt scent of persistence and punishment, while the sun burned low on the horizon. His chest rose steadily, eyes forward, muscles taut, a man convinced he had deciphered the calculus of survival and dominance, unaware that the true lessons of the pipeline were far from complete, and that the final reckoning would test more than strength or skill. The morning sun carved sharp lines across Coronado Beach, reflecting off the meticulously polished whites of Class 342. Families filled the stands, their faces bright with pride, eyes scanning the formation of candidates with admiration and expectation. Sand, damp from the morning tide, compressed under the weight of disciplined boots, each step resonating with the cadence of ritual and tradition. The salty air carried the faint tang of sunscreen and the distant roar of surf, a sensory backdrop to the culmination of months of grueling training. Rear Admiral Thomas Brenner stood at the podium, his posture absolute, every crease in his uniform precise. His eyes swept across the formation, every face catalogued, every expression registered. The trident, gleaming in ceremonial light, rested in the case before him, a symbol of mastery earned only through strength, endurance, and, above all, honor. Today, we pin the trident on warriors. That the Brotherhood has one gatekeeper, honor, he declared, his voice resonant, unyielding, carrying across the beach in precise cadence. David Thorne stepped forward, chest lifted, chin high, shoulders squared with the confidence of one who had convinced himself of invincibility. Every micro-adjustment in gait and posture communicated control, fists flexing ever so slightly, shoulders rolling back in a conscious display of dominance, jaw set with the precision of one trained to command his presence. He inhaled, chest rising with shallow, controlled breaths, scanning the audience, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the very scrutiny he sought had shifted from assessment to judgment. Brenner's voice cut sharply, unflinching. "Turn around, Candidate Thorne. Face the families." David paused, a flicker of micro-conflict crossing his expression, lips tightening, brow furrowing just slightly as he obeyed. The motion was mechanical, but not without hesitation. The weight of past actions pressed invisibly on his posture. He turned, and the giant screen behind the podium flickered to life, the first frame, coffee shop HD footage. The shove, Taylor hitting the floor in slow-motion horror, the expression on her face frozen in visceral alarm. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a wave of recognition and disbelief. David's pupils dilated minutely, a subtle betrayal of adrenaline as his eyes tracked the projection, jaw tightening reflexively. The second frame, the O Club kitchen, audio captured every syllable of his venomous words, clear, precise, unmediated. The cadence, the aggression, the calculated contempt, it was impossible to deny. Micro-expressions crossed his face, lips parted slightly, a twitch in his left eyelid, nostrils flaring as he processed the dual reality of technical exposure and moral condemnation. The third frame, sealed records, assault charges, domestic violence, a dishonorable discharge from the Army Reserves filed under the alias David Torres. Each datum, each official mark of failure, landed with juridical authority. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, a tidal wave of disgust washing over benches, families, and candidates alike. Brenner's voice thundered again, precise and absolute. "Candidate David Thorne, you are stripped of status. You are under arrest for fraudulent enlistment and assault. MPS, remove this individual from my beach." To master arms moved in, trained hands gripping his arms with unyielding control. David screamed, every ounce of cultivated bravado stripped away. Kicks and claws tore at the sand as if physical violence could reclaim the dominance evaporated by evidence and honor. Whites, once pristine, were now marred with grit and sweat. His voice cracked under the weight of reality, the high-pitched, desperate declaration slicing the air. I'm a SEAL. Brenner's stare, icy and unflinching, met the spectacle. His voice was cold, a scalpel of authority severing illusion from fact. You're a tourist. The MPs tightened their hold, dragging him past the stunned candidates, past the hushed spectators. Every footstep in the sand echoed the finality of judgment. Micro-expressions of shock, disbelief, and internal reckoning flickered across David's face, eyes wide, nostrils flared, jaw clenched, yet beneath all the rage and desperation, the truth had landed, undeniable and absolute. The beach, sunlit and ceremonial, became a theater of consequence, each grain of sand a witness to the intersection of skill, arrogance, and immutable honor. The beach remained bathed in the pale gold of late morning, the surf a steady percussion against sand hardened by the footsteps of warriors and families alike. The ceremony pressed forward, each cadence deliberate, each motion a reflection of months of rigorous discipline and sacrifice. The candidates, still lined in immaculate whites, maintained posture as precise as the ocean's horizon, eyes forward, muscles taut yet measured. The air was thick with the scent of salt, sunscreen, and subtle traces of sweat, an olfactory testament to endurance. Rear Admiral Thomas Brenner stepped from the podium with deliberate calm, scanning the assembly with eyes that had seen the worst of combat and the intricacies of human failure. His gaze paused on the formation, cataloging micro-expressions, tightened jaws, pupils dilating under sunlight, fingers flexing against pant seams. He drew a slow, controlled breath, shoulders squared, posture unyielding, the embodiment of authority, as he called forward Taylor Vance. Taylor moved toward the podium with measured steps, each footfall deliberate, balancing 9 months of pregnancy with the pose of someone accustomed to command. Her simple navy dress flowed over the subtle curve of her belly, yet her movements were precise, shoulders aligned, chin lifted with quiet dignity. Fingers lightly flexed on the sides of the dress, she adjusted her stride, micro-corrections ensuring stability, each subtle shift betraying the awareness of weight distribution and center of gravity. Her eyes, rimmed with the faintest traces of fatigue, were steady, absorbing the beach, the formation, and the crowd without faltering. Brenner extended a hand, presenting a small velvet box. The polished hinge reflected sunlight, catching against the backdrop of sand and surf. Mike never got to hold his son. The teams take care of their own, Brenner said, his tone precise, a measured cadence that conveyed both authority and the weight of personal history. His eyes softened briefly as he met Taylor's gaze, a flicker of sheer understanding passing between the survivor of loss and the guardian of honor. Taylor's fingers closed around the box, her nails pressing lightly into the velvet as if testing the reality of its weight. She lifted it to her chest momentarily, inhaling slowly, chest rising in controlled rhythm. Micro-ticks in her jaw revealed emotion restrained by disciplined control. She opened the box, revealing the gleaming trident, polished meticulously, the symbol of Mike's service and valor. The insignia gleamed with the sun's reflection, each prong sharp and exact, an emblem of sacrifice and continuity. The microphone waited, positioned at the precise height to capture her voice without distortion. Taylor's lips parted slowly, a measured inhale drawing strength from memory and resolve. Strength isn't about how hard you hit, it's about who you protect. Each word carried weight, deliberate, enunciated with clarity that resonated across the sand, surf, and assembly. Her eyes, reflecting the sun and the shadow of loss, scanned the crowd, resting briefly on families who had lost, who had fought, and who had endured. Micro-expressions flickered across her face, a tightened jaw, a subtle lift of eyebrows, the faintest quiver at the corner of her mouth, all coalescing into a testament of restrained power. The assembly responded instantly. Applause rose in waves, swelling from the benches into a unified crescendo. Hands came together with sharp precision, the claps echoing against the beach, punctuated by the hum of conversation, tears, and whispered reverence. The candidates, still in formation, maintained composure yet allowed micro-shifts of acknowledgement. Shoulders flexed in recognition, subtle nods, the faint rise and fall of chests betraying suppressed relief and respect. Taylor held the trident aloft briefly, the metallic emblem catching the sun, reflecting a story of sacrifice, honor, and the invisible threads connecting those who serve and those they protect. Her breathing, controlled yet audible, conveyed both triumph and the weight of enduring grief, every micro-expression a mirror of the strength required to survive, to honor, and to safeguard memory. To stand beneath her shoes became witness to the intersection of personal loss and collective valor, the surf's cadence an unspoken hymn of continuity and resilience. The applause rose higher, a tidal wave of acknowledgement that rolled across the stands and candidates alike. Every face reflected awareness, understanding, and the recognition of what true strength demanded. Taylor's lips curved into the faintest, almost imperceptible smile, a micro-expression of quiet triumph that spoke louder than words, a closure for grief and the opening of a legacy. 3 weeks had carved their rhythm into Coronado, the early December sunlight soft against the pale stucco of the anchor. The café pulsed with life, a mosaic of conversations, the clatter of ceramic cups, and the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. Air carried the mingling scents of freshly ground coffee, buttery pastries, and faint seawater from the nearby shore, layering sensory textures over the ordinary familiarity of neighborhood life. Every table was occupied, laughter ricocheting in arcs over polished wood, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware. The small space, once austere, now breathed with community, resilience, and quiet celebration. Taylor Vance sat at her usual table, body angled just so, a mother of 1 week cradling her son in a tiny frog-patterned onesie. Her posture, though relaxed, retained the precision of a trained operator. Shoulders back, back straight, chin level, one hand gently supporting the infant's head, the other tracing the subtle rise and fall of his chest. The baby's breathing was shallow but strong, a rhythm she monitored with micro-observations, tiny flicks of the eyelid, twitch of a fist, subtle curl of a lip, each movement catalogued, registered, reassured. Taylor's eyes softened as she watched, a subtle contraction of her jaw and a barely perceptible upward tilt at the corners of her mouth betraying the pride and relief she carried quietly beneath her calm exterior. The cafe bell jingled sharply. Taylor's head tilted slightly, a micro-turn that caught her attention before her body followed. Thomas Brenner entered, civilian clothes cutting a clean line against the warm light of the cafe, eyes scanning quickly before locking onto her. The faintest purse of his lips, a micro-furrow in the brow, and the subtle set of his shoulders conveyed assessment and acknowledgement. He moved with a quiet authority, each step deliberate, boots silent against the polished floor. A small, almost imperceptible shift in his weight hinted at the years of habit that demanded control even outside uniform, even in a space meant for respite. Black coffee, he ordered, voice calm, controlled, the tone habitual, precise, leaving no room for error. He settled opposite Taylor, knees at exact right angles, hands resting lightly on the tabletop, fingers flexing subtly, nails pressing against the wood with almost imperceptible micro-pressure. He exhaled slowly, measuring, reading. Taylor's lips curved into a faint smile, eyes narrowing just slightly as they met his strong heartbeat. She asked, her voice carrying warmth but measured with the same precision of a tactical operator assessing a mission's variables. Her thumb brushed lightly against her son's soft cheek, monitoring the infant's responses, microfacial twitches, flutter of eyelashes, tiny curling of toes. Just like his dad, she added, a delicate smile, lips barely parting, jaw relaxed but not fully surrendered, a balance between emotion and measured presence. Brenner's gaze lingered on the child briefly, a micro-contraction at the corner of his eye suggesting both recognition and the acknowledgement of responsibility carried through others' protection. Thorne took the plea, 5 years Leavenworth. After that, this town has a long memory, he stated, voice precise, unflinching, each syllable deliberate, the cadence carrying weight beyond the immediate conversation. A small twitch at the side of his mouth betrayed an emotion restrained, a flash of satisfaction tempered with procedural coldness. Taylor's hand reached across the table, squeezing his in a micro-pressure that conveyed gratitude, without words, fingers flexing and relaxing against his palm with deliberate restraint. "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly, voice resonant with the quiet intensity of lived experience and survived conflict. Brenner lifted his cup, the movement deliberate, muscles flexing subtly beneath civilian fabric. "Don't thank me. Thank the coffee," he replied, a micro-smirk at the corner of his mouth the only concession to levity. The gesture precise, controlled, his posture a map of decades of discipline still intact in civilian life. The camera's perspective rose slowly through the window, tracing the bustling cafe, the street beyond humming with movement and life, the sun illuminating San Diego's bright sky. The scene captured the intersection of ordinary life and the extraordinary consequences of courage, discipline, and moral resolve. Every face, every micro-expression, every measured action stood as witness to the closure of one chapter and the quiet opening of another. The infant, chest rising and falling in rhythm with security, love, and continuity, symbolized the enduring outcome of protection, honor, and consequence. Subscribe to the channel now and join us for every thrilling moment.